everyone, and welcome to our webinar to launch our guidance on supporting good practice with care-experienced children in police custody. We are thrilled that so many of you have been able to join us today, and of course our panel of experts who you'll hear from later. At the end, there'll be some time for questions to the panel, so please use the Q&A function throughout the event if you'd like to ask any questions. The event itself is being recorded and will be on the CYCJ website, a link to which will be sent into the chat along with any other papers that we mentioned today. I am Fiona Dyer, I'm Interim Director at the Children and Young People Centre for Justice, and I'm thrilled to be chairing today's event. Over the years, we have undertaken research into care-experienced children and their involvement in the justice system. And this work has involved work with Police Scotland to reduce police call-outs to children's houses. At the same time in England, Howard League were doing similar research, which led them to writing guidance for solicitors representing children in police custody in England and Wales. When I read their guidance, I approached Claire Sands from Howard League and asked if I could Scotify it, as I thought it would be of great value in Scotland. And I'm really pleased she let me do that. So in partnership with the Child Law Centre, who co-authored the guidance, our participation groups who contributed, STARR and Youth Just Us, and support from the Law Society. And after slight delays due to COVID, I'm extremely pleased that we are here today. In Scotland, we're in a slightly different position to south of the border. The Scottish Government policy changed in 2011 when it introduced the whole system approach. This approach aimed to divert children from formal justice measures. And this is reiterated in their new Vision and Action Plan, a rights, respect and approach to justice for children and young people that was published in June this year. And it represents a shared foundation between the Scottish Government and partners to continue to support the agenda to keep children out of the criminal justice system and promote the use of the whole system approach. So since 2011, there has been a large reduction in the number of children in our adult justice system, although there are still too many children there. And the Independent Care Review highlighted that care-experienced children still are overrepresented in the justice system. They reported that children with care experience are more likely than their peers to experience police contact and criminalisation, despite no evidence that they commit greater offences than other children. They're also less likely to receive support at the police station from family or a responsible adult, which can affect their experience of police custody and the criminal justice outcomes. This issue was highlighted as a priority area in the promise, and there are specific actions in the Promise Change Plan for 21-24, which stipulate that the disproportionate criminalisation of care-experienced children and young people will end, that 16 and 17-year-olds will no longer be placed in a young offenders institution for sentence or remand, that there will be sufficient community-based alternatives so that detention is a last resort, and that children who do need to have their liberty restricted will be cared for small, secure, safe, trauma-informed environments that uphold their rights. This, of course, supports the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child that states no child should be held in detention unless as a last resort and for the shortest time possible. And both the incorporation of the UN CRC into Scots law and the recommendations of the Care Review have the full backing of the Scottish Government. So why is there a need for this guidance? Well, from our own research at CYCJ into the use of bail and remand, we spoke to young people and their families, many of whom were care experienced. And the themes and experience coming out of these interviews was that police custody was often perceived to be the most stressful and frightening aspect of the justice process, with having a big impact on mental health and emotional well-being. With one young person saying, because of the amount of time I was in the cell all night, I was just crying myself to sleep, I was taking an anxiety attack, I was an emotional wreck and I couldn't stop crying all weekend. Lengthy stays were also highlighted as an issue, with children describing the length of time they were in police custody, often over the course of a weekend or a bank holiday weekend, and this was compounded by a long day in the cells within the court. Proximity to adults was also raised as an issue by some children being held in close proximity, often over the full time and especially on the transport to court. Issues of communication were also raised. especially a real lack of communications with parents and carers, and some saying they didn't know where their child was. And one actually said it wasn't until she went to report her son missing to the police that she found out he was actually in police custody. And what was also very concerning was the lack of knowledge of basic human rights that some children were telling us about. The ability to use the toilet in private, have access to sanitary products, or get a wash before they appeared in court. So why are looked after children overrepresented in the justice system? How can we stop it, and whose responsibility is it? Well, we are here today to say that we all have a collective responsibility to make changes and ensure that children's rights are being respected. And as solicitors, you have a specific role in this, and we hope the guidance will help you fulfil this. The guidance itself highlights 9 key principles linking to evidence, research, and information from young people themselves. It highlights that many young people in the justice system have speech, language, and communication needs, and often don't know what is happening to them, and they certainly have a lack of ability to participate. And that's even for children that have been in the system before. It talks about how it's important to young people, what's important to them, how to engage with them and build trust in relationships, advocating for their rights and highlighting the roles and responsibilities of others in the system, and including those that are corporate parents. It identifies priority areas to meet the UNCRC, like limited time in custody, diverting from court processes where possible, and if at court, advocating for remittal to the children's hearing system. Currently, only 7 or 8% of all children under 18 at court have their cases remitted to the children's hearing system, where this is a process that actually they can participate in, and that takes cognizance of their specific circumstances and needs. The Committee on the Rights of the Child, concluding observations in 2016, said that to ensure that children in conflict with the law are always dealt with in the juvenile justice system up to age 18. This was also highlighted by the promise in 2020 that Scotland must consider how to ensure children have the totality of their cases dealt with in an environment that upholds their rights and allows them to effectively participate in proceedings. And traditional criminal courts are not settings in which children's rights can be upheld and where they can be heard. This was summed up by a CYCJ report of our previous director, Claire Lightowler, Rights Respecting Scotland's Approach to Children in Conflict with the Law, that many children in conflict with the law in Scotland do not experience justice in the true sense of the word. So as part of this guidance, we have also co-produced information on children's rights that Beth-Anne will tell us about, and which this can be printed out and given to any children you are working with. There's also information for practitioners and carers to support them, to support the children they care for. So we hope you find today in the suite of guidance documents interesting and useful for your work. I would like to now hand over to our first speaker of today, Claire Sands from Howard League Penal Reform. She's the Research and Policy Manager. And for the past 6 years, she's been working on Howard League's programme to end the unnecessary criminalisation of children in residential care in England and Wales. And it actually won an award, the CYP Now Youth Justice Award in 2018. And it's due to Claire's work that we are all here today. So Claire, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to share some slides with you now, hopefully. There we go. Can everybody see those? Yeah, good. Well, thank you so much, Fiona, for asking me to speak at this event. We are so thrilled that our guide has been reworked and, I have to say, much improved by CYCJ into this new guide for lawyers in Scotland. So huge congratulations to everybody who's been involved in that. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Fiona and Debbie and everybody else at CYCJ. You've been such an amazing supporter of our residential care programme, and we've benefited so much from all your fantastic work that you've done in this area and from the cross-fertilisation of ideas. And we were particularly grateful to be invited up to see you in 2018. And of course, I'm so proud to be an associate of the CYCJ, so thank you. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. So I'm going to speak for a few minutes about the Howard League's programme of work in England and why we decided to produce our guide for lawyers. As you can see, our programme was primarily concerned with children in residential care, although the guide does cover children in all types of care placements. And I'll explain why we took this focus in a minute. Oh, can't go on to the next slide. There we go. So before I talk about the residential care programme, a little bit about the Howard League in England and Wales. So we were founded in 1866 by admirers of John Howard, a famous prison reformer. During the 20th century, we've played a key role in many of the major criminal justice reforms, from the abolition of corporal and capital punishment to the formation of the probation service and encouraging support for victims of crime. And today we campaign for less crime, safer communities and fewer people in prison through our policy, research and campaigning work. Since 2002, we've had a legal team in-house, which works with children and young people who are in prison under the age of 21. And we run a free legal advice line for this group, and our team of amazing lawyers take upward of 100 calls on this advice line every week. We're a membership organisation and we receive no government funding, so that gives us a lot of freedom. As Fiona said, our programme to end the disproportionate and unnecessary criminalisation of children in residential care began in 2016. Our interest in this area stems from another campaign that we've been running since 2010 to reduce the levels of child arrests. As you can see on the slide, in 2010 there were nearly 250,000 child arrests in England and Wales. Over the last 10 years, for a variety of reasons, this figure has reduced by about 74%, and in 2020 we saw 63,200 child arrests. We've been speaking to police forces around the country to find out why children were being arrested and what more could be done to prevent unnecessary arrests. And one of the things that came up time and again when we spoke to the police were concerns that some children's homes were calling them too frequently and for the kinds of things that parents would not call the police over. And examples of the sorts of things the police told us about were breaking a mug and children refusing to go to bed. When we started our programme, we found that there wasn't any available data on the numbers of children in residential care who are being criminalised, and that little was known or understood about the issue. So one of the first things we did was to obtain some data to evidence the extent of the problem. Data on rates of criminalisation in England was being published annually, but it was being published as an amalgamated figure for all children in care, i.e. it wasn't being broken down by placement type. When we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for the data to be broken down into rates for those in residential care and for children in all other types of care placements, which would mainly be foster care placements, it was very illuminating and shocking, as you can see from this chart. So those blue bars represent children living in children's homes, and the orange ones relate to children in all other types of care placements. And you'll see that in 2014, 15% of children in residential care were formally criminalised, and that compared to 4% of children in other types of care placements. Now, it's important to note that the English government only collects data on children who've been looked after continuously for 12 months or more. About 50% of children will be coming in and out of care for shorter periods, and their data isn't captured. It's therefore the case that the true extent of the disproportionality will be considerably higher than this chart shows. If you look across to the right of the chart, you'll see that rates have fallen very significantly over the last 5 years. A child in residential care in 2020 was 3 times less likely to be criminalised than they were in 2014. Now, this is of course great news, and it's particularly impressive considering more teenagers with complex needs are coming into care than ever before. However, rates of criminalisation have been falling much more rapidly for all children during the last decade, i.e. those both in and not in care. These have fallen by 82% in the last 10 years and by 12% in the year ending March 2020. In that year, less than 0.5% of all children were criminalised, so there's still a lot of work for us to do. The disproportionate levels of criminalisation of children who've been in care are reflected in both the child and the adult prison populations. So the most recent figures we have from HM Inspectorate of Prisons show that over half of the children in child prisons have experienced local authority care. A study in 2013 of nearly 4,000 adult prisoners in England recorded that around a quarter reported care experience. But data on this characteristic of the adult prison population is not systematically collected, and organisations such as the Care Leavers Association believe that it's likely to significantly underrepresent the number of adults in prison who've experienced care. So at the beginning of the programme, we focused mainly on the gateway to the criminal justice system, and we worked with children's homes and the police to try to prevent police contact and arrest. And the work with the police has been particularly successful, with many forces embarking on projects to reduce call-outs from homes and to improve partnerships with homes, social services and other relevant agencies. The launch of the National Protocol on Reducing Criminalisation of Looked After Children and Care Leavers in November 2018 has also been used by some forces as an impetus for improvements to multi-agency working. And you'll see from the examples I've given on the slide of work done by various police forces that dramatic improvements can be made in relatively short timeframes. We were aware that children in care needed specialist help at every stage of the criminal justice system, and we were keen to widen the scope of our programme and the impact that we were making. We were able to pool our policy and legal expertise at the Howard League and tap into the police station expertise of legal colleagues at the Youth Justice Legal Centre, part of Just for Kids Law, to produce this guide for lawyers. Youth justice lawyers need a unique combination of specialist legal knowledge, insight into the many issues that will affect their clients, and interpersonal skills to enable them to help children feel supported, engender trust, and encourage them to open up. Lawyers need to be able to explain a complex legal process in a way that individual children can understand. They also need to be able to stand up for children's rights and their needs and effectively be their champion when they might have nobody else there to do that job for them. Whilst primarily aimed at lawyers, we believe that this guide is essential reading for anybody who is working with children from any type of care placement who's been arrested, and would include in that group police, appropriate adults, social workers and carers. And together with colleagues from the Youth Justice Legal Centre, we've given presentations on this guide to over 1,000 criminal justice lawyers in England. We've produced 6 briefings on the programme covering a range of topics, and whilst the focus is on England and Wales, there will be overlap that may be of interest to some of you. So areas we've covered include the elements that make for a good children's home, where children are not unnecessarily criminalised, the importance of good police data, good policing practice, and the latest a briefing on child criminal exploitation and how the current children's how the current structure of children's residential care in England and Wales is helping to fuel that problem. We've also produced a briefing that tells the stories of 4 children who were unnecessarily criminalised in their own words. And we found that working with children and young people with lived experience was absolutely vital to the work that we did on this programme, and it's informed every single aspect of the work that we've done. And all the briefings can be found on our programme webpage, and I've included that URL on the last slide that I'll get to in a minute. I also wanted to mention a new guide that the Howard League published last month, Making Black Lives Matter in the Criminal Justice System, a guide for anti-racist lawyers. This has been produced in association with Black Protest Legal Support and in consultation with an expert advisory board. As it says, it's aimed at lawyers supporting clients of all ages. It's extremely relevant to lawyers working with children in the English youth justice system, given that shamefully over 50% of children in English prisons now are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And like our other guide, it offers a mix of legal and practical advice, and you can see their website address there if you'd like to take a look at that. So thank you for listening. Here's the URL for our programme webpage, which is links to our briefings. Congratulations again to everybody for producing this guide, and I hope you're all going to find it really useful. Thank you.
Claire, thank you so much. Everyone would be clapping away if we were actually face to face, I'm sure. And remember, if you've got any questions for Claire, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But I'd now like to hand you over to our second speaker of today, my colleague and friend, Irina Beaton. Irina is the director of the Scottish Child Law Centre and is a qualified solicitor in Russia and Scots law. She's an accredited specialist in child law with the Law Society of Scotland. Irina has extensive experience in working with and assisting clients on issues related to children and family law, private client work, employment law, and medical negligence work, as well as clients with diagnosed mental health programmes under carers. She's also a tutor to the first-year law students at Edinburgh University Law School on family law, curator ad litem for the Mental Health Tribunal for Scotland, and a safeguarder to children and young people within the children's hearing system. So just a few qualifications to bring her here today. So it's a pleasure to have worked with Irina in co-producing this guidance, and she's going to speak to us a wee bit more about UNCRC and children's rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and welcome everybody, ladies and gentlemen, and hopefully some young people who might be attending this event today as well. As Fiona introduced me, I'm Irina Beaton. I'm a director of the Scottish Child Law Centre. And what we do at the Scottish Child Law Centre, among many other things, we provide free advice about children's rights and child law in Scotland, including in relation to children who come into contact with the police and the criminal justice system. And between August 2020 and August 2021, we received approximately 120 queries related to criminal law and children's rights. An overwhelming majority of the queries that were raised by adults in relation to children. And what we've learned is that the adults themselves and the children in relation to whom they were calling actually lack knowledge about children's rights altogether. So when Fiona approached me with an idea of working together on this project, I became very excited as I could see immediately the benefits that this resort and accompanying guides to professionals, social workers, carers, and for children themselves can bring. And as Fiona mentioned, COVID-19 put some spanners in our works, but I'm very pleased that we have been able to see this project through and finalize it and launch it today. It's a very exciting day for us. Many of you who work with children in Scotland would have noticed there's been lots of policy and legislative changes happening in Scotland. Among them is equal protection legislation that did away with the excuse of reasonable chastisement of children. Of course, the raising of the age of criminal responsibility to 12 and hopefully going further as well. The new Children's Scotland Act 2020 and consultation to increase the remit of the children's hearing system to potentially include all children under age of 18. There is a review of the National Child Protection Guidance and the Promise Plan as well. And of course, last but not least, I must give special shout out to the incorporation of the UNCRC in Scotland. We're all eagerly awaiting decision of the High Court and to see what's going to be happening next. I think we can all agree this is an exciting time in the children's rights sphere in Scotland. And today I wanted to talk about the importance of the knowledge of rights for children, especially care experienced children who come into contact with the criminal justice system. The guide that CYCJ and SLC have produced highlights the importance of understanding what it means to have rights. For most of you, as Fiona actually already mentioned, that it might not be surprised to learn that care experienced children are much more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system without there being actual evidence to suggest they commit more serious offenses than any other children. And this means that children who have experienced trauma, neglect, abuse, and other negative circumstances are more likely to be further disadvantaged in life by coming into contact with criminal justice system. This in itself can create a perception of child being difficult, stigmatizing child further, and preventing the child from achieving positive outcomes. Our guide highlights that having been in contact with criminal justice system, care experienced children can still have poor understanding of their rights, what it means to have them, and how this can change their experience at the police station. The starting position should, of course, be that children should not be detained in police custody, and only if there is no alternative this should happen, and only for the shortest period of time necessary. Detention should only be a measure of last resort for shortest possible time. Our guide encourages professionals to consider alternatives to police station. Does the child need to be interviewed at a police station altogether? Being detained in police custody could be extremely upsetting. It can re-traumatize the child who has already experienced trauma before. And being stigmatized and having traumatic experiences in police custody does not support child's right to recovery from trauma and reintegration. One of the fundamental rights a child has is the right to be safe. And how does it translate in practice? To say to someone, you have rights, would make very little difference unless it's backed up by an explanation of what it means, making rights tangible to children. It means that if you're cold, you can have a blanket. If you're thirsty and hungry, you can have water and something to eat. If you need to change your clothes, you have the right to have clothes that fit you. And it's vital that children are told such fundamental information information such as, if you need medication and sanitary products, you can ask for them and these items should be provided to you. If they need to use bathroom, they can do so knowing that the CCTV image is pixelated. We often hear at the advice line, parents who call us, and sometimes children ask us a question, is asking to speak to a solicitor would make the child look guilty? And the answer might seem very obvious to us, but it isn't so for a child who is upset, worried, scared, trying to mask their vulnerability with expression of bravado, or would confess to anything just to be allowed to go home. The guide refers to accounts of care experienced children who have been questioned and detained in police custody across Scotland, and they report that it is not a pleasant experience. Most people in the audience will be aware of ACE's study and the importance of using trauma-informed approach in their work. We know that when in a state of trauma, a person isn't able to access their full brain capacity, which is why people in such circumstances shouldn't make a decision when they're in the trauma zone. This is particularly important for children whose brain is, as one might say, under construction. Children accused of offending behavior often experience adversity and trauma, and this can prevent them from developing in a rate that would be maybe similar to a child in different circumstances, not care experienced children. And they could have range of needs, mental health difficulties and learning difficulties, which might not be obvious from the onset. Our guide highlights the importance of being attuned to those considerations and the importance of information gathering with child's permission to represent the child and advocate for their rights in the most effective way. Because children's brain is developing, it also means that given the right opportunities and circumstances, child's brain can make remarkable recovery by learning new tools to cope with traumatic situations. So imagine traumatic experiences creating broken bones. If you create opportunities for children to engage in the process of recovery, the bones heal and get stronger. If you don't, the bones remain porous with permanent holes inside and are more susceptible to further damage from subsequent traumatic incidents. In 2017, SCLC held a conference where I was one of the speakers. And during my speech, I referred to now a rather old document called the Guidance of the Council, the Guidance of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe on Child-Friendly Justice from 2011. And it seems that I've come a full circle because I am actually going to refer to this document again. It tells us that to create a child-friendly justice system, you need to start with providing clear, useful, and reliable information to the child at all stages of the proceedings. This useful information can be provided by phone, social work, it could be provided by anyone, social work, teacher, and especially solicitor. All of the professionals working with care experiencing children should be aware of child's rights. To put forward legal documents to support and protect child's rights, there is no better professional to do it than a solicitor. A solicitor who is attuned to the special circumstances and needs of their vulnerable client will do an even better job. We hope that by making this guide available to all professionals and children themselves, we are doing our part to take a step closer to improving both process and outcomes for care experiencing children coming into contact with criminal justice system in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. Couldn't find my button there. Thank you so much. That was great. And again, if you've got any questions for Irina, please do put them in the chat. But I'll move swiftly on to our next speaker now. Beth-Anne Logan is currently a non-executive director for Children's here in Scotland, and at the time of her appointment, she was the youngest person ever appointed to a non-departmental public body. Beth-Anne works for North Lanarkshire Council as a promise development worker, helping to embed the promise across North Lanarkshire. She is the current founder and chair of the STARR group, Scotland's only curated space for secure care experienced people, and works as a consultant with us at CYCJ. Beth-Anne is also co-chair of the Best Place in the World work group at the Independent Care Review. She has a fierce passion for ensuring Scotland's children and their families have everything they need to grow up to feel loved, safe and respected, which I'm sure we will hear today. She's working tirelessly across the sector to ensure the vision of the promise becomes a reality. Over to you, Beth-Anne.
Hi everybody, thank you for joining today and thanks for that fab introduction, Fiona. So I suppose myself and Fiona had a chat a few months back around young people not knowing their rights when they enter police custody, and the need for them to be an info sheet or a leaflet or something that told young people what their rights were, because they didn't know them. People with lived experience that were entering the custody system didn't know what their rights were. They didn't know that they were entitled to a shower before they went to court. They didn't know that they were entitled to sanitary products. They didn't understand that they could go to the toilet and that the camera was blurred out, and couldn't see them going to the toilet. And I guess as chair of the STARR group, which is Scotland's only curated space for security experienced people, and working with young people, we realised that this was a significant issue, and an issue that needed resolve quite quickly. So there's an info sheet for practitioners, and that you have put, Holly has put in through the chat, and there's also the info sheet for children and young people that will be kind of put out. And again, like echoing what Fiona was saying in her introduction, the promise has made it specifically clear that no under 18 should be in police custody, and that 16 and 17-year-olds should be dealt with through the children's hearing system as well. That's going to take a big shift. It's going to take a culture shift, and it's going to be difficult. We're going to be coming up against barriers and stuff like that, etc. But it absolutely can be done, and it has to be done, because they're children at the end of the day, and we owe our children a lot more than what we're currently giving them. And often people talk about outcomes, or they might be going on to positive destinations and things like that. And something that the STARR groups really kind of wants to focus on is who decides what's a good outcome and who decides what's a positive destination. So how do we know that our young people and our children and their families are thriving and not just surviving? How do we know that they've reached a good destination because we as professionals have said that, oh, that's a good destination for you to do hairdressing or for you to be a mechanic, without actually tapping into the untapped potential of children and young people. And I'm lucky enough that I've had people believe in me from a very young age and empowered me and encouraged me to do and be whatever I want, which is why I'm in the role that I'm doing today, because I want to make sure that other young people have that opportunity and have that champion and that cheerleader, in order to support them to fulfil their potential. I think one of the things that we focused on at the Independent Care Review, when I was co-chair of Best Place alongside John Carrigan, was how do we build childhoods for our children and young people and their families? So what is it they need? Is it that they need more time at home or at nursery, less kind of delaying things in school and things like that? For young people that are coming in contact with the justice system, what is it that we need to know? We need to be more empathic and more understanding of our circumstances. We need to look at it through a trauma-informed but also a trauma-responsive lens as well, because at the end of the day, these children and young people have experienced significant adversity within their life. Oftentimes they've been bounced from pillar to post, had multiple placement moves, haven't been able to put roots down and feel settled. And I'm a firm believer that all behaviour is communication. And there's no such thing as a bad child. There's environmental factors, there's social factors, economic factors, and I just really believe that these children and young people don't want to go out and be bad, or commit crimes or things like that. But I think they've got to the stage where they don't know how else to express how they're feeling. So we need to get better at understanding the roots of that. What's the root cause of that, and what can we do to support you? And some of the things that's in the info sheet is about young people having the right to have a solicitor, but it's still the young person's responsibility to ask for the solicitor. So maybe that's something that we need to work upon over the next few years if we are going to realise the ambitions of the promise. You'll not automatically be given a solicitor, which I don't think is right. I think that they should be given a solicitor. And also looking at kind of the right to have a trusted adult with you, which we know can often be difficult for care experienced people because of the situation that they've found themselves in. Residential staff or foster carers or friendship carers aren't always fully aware that where their kids are. I heard reports of people being reported missing and turning up and they've been in police custody. But also focusing on the young person's right to ask questions and be curious. They're allowed to ask questions, and they're allowed to try and make sense and piece together what's going on in their little brains to understand the impact of what's actually happening round about them. And also things, basic human rights about children and young people not knowing that young people that they're entitled to food and drink, that they're entitled to ask for suitable clothing if they've not got their clothes with them. They're entitled to having contact with a nurse or a doctor and receive good medical care. They're also entitled, if they've got a social worker, they're entitled for the social worker to have regular visits. How often or not does that happen is a bit of disparity across the country and even within local authorities as well, and that's not good enough. But also, like, if you're care experienced, you've got the right to have extra support, but that's not always followed through and that's not always taken into consideration. And there's a lot of awareness raising and stuff that I feel still needs to be done with Police Scotland, for example, about how they are responding to the needs of care experienced people, because their needs are different from but equally we should be treating children as children at the end of the day. And if we have to be compliant with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, that's something that we really need to focus on. But there's also an awareness of trauma and being trauma informed and trauma responsive, and trying to pick apart what it is that's going on for that young person, rather than kind of trying to figure out how the behaviour that's been displayed has resulted in a crime being committed, and trying to marry the two of them up, because it's going to be like a magnet effect where they're not going to be able to stick together. If you ever try to do that with magnets and you face that resistance, they're not going to marry up, because we're not taking in cognitive ability, we're not taking in the possibility that they maybe have learning difficulties or other kind of health problems, their mental age, mental capacity, maybe younger than what they are currently presenting. And I think that there's a real opportunity with the landscape changing within the sector, within the promise. We have the promise, we've got the Youth Justice Review, we've got everybody kind of rallying around together to try and realise the ambitions of the promise. But actually none of that will be achieved if we don't start working together. And I think that's why webinars such as this are really important, for people to come together, to connect, to share learning, to share information, and to really begin to understand how we can support our country's children and their families. Because at the end of the day, it's Scotland's responsibility to do so, and we have a duty to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth-Anne. And it's really great to hear from you and all the work you've been doing on this. And I really appreciate your support. Another way we are working ourselves in CYCJ, we have another group as well as STARR. We've got Youth Just Us, and we're currently working with Police Scotland in relation to look at some of these challenges and things you've raised, Beth-Anne. So hopefully we'll be able to do that in partnership going forward. So our last speaker today, sorry, again, if you've got any questions for Beth-Anne, please put them in the chat. I'm really pleased to introduce our last speaker for today, Gillian Mawdsley. Gillian is currently works for the Scottish Law Society. She's a qualified and practicing solicitor with a range of policy and practical experience from the Scottish Criminal Justice Organisation, including COPFS, SLAB and the Scottish Court Service, as well as previously been seconded to the Scottish Government. She also teaches in a variety of legal subjects at under and postgraduate level at various UK universities, including Strathclyde, Edinburgh and the Open University. So it's a pleasure to have Gillian here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you for the invitation. My kind of, what I'm going to talk about here is maybe slightly different from what some of the others have been speaking to. And I think the first thing to say is that I work currently for the Law Society of Scotland, and a number of you will be aware of that organisation, but anyone that is a solicitor in Scotland has to be a member of the Law Society of Scotland. And that's important to remember, because I think at the foremost, when you're looking at the role of a solicitor, you need to think what the solicitor's job is in relation to children and in relation to the criminal justice system. So our job fundamentally is to act in the best interests of our client. And in relation to the group that you're talking about, the client is obviously the child. And where I think it's very, very important, this kind of guide and all the information that you've all been talking about is about that key aspect, and that's about information. When I was beginning as a solicitor, there was very little training. There's much more training now, and indeed Fiona's alluded to my background in training, both and also included judicial training as well. And that allows that opportunity for information to permeate through the solicitor at whatever range or age of experience they have. But our experience is very much, our learning comes from experience with clients, as well as, if you like, that formal learning. So one of the reasons that we were pleased to support the work that was being done here was it was about an attempt to put information out there, information that is practical and that might help a solicitor at different stages of their career. So I think that's why we're pleased to support the information, and hopefully that will help to inform and to warn and to advise solicitors that it's not a case of just coming in and it's a child, therefore this set of examples and formula works, or indeed you've got to approach it from a holistic point of view of the client in front of you. And I think that's where Beth-Anne's experience and talking comes into being, because it is about it being at that police station. We can't stop the child being detained in custody. I can certainly have a very good argument with a custody sergeant, and I can have a very forceful discussion, but fundamentally something has happened that has triggered that child ending up in the police station as part of the justice system. And I want to tell one story that perhaps illustrates our role as a solicitor and why it's not about what we call the black letter law. And I was called out one day to Stewart Street. Some of you may know Glasgow. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. It was a Sunday evening into a Monday, and there was a young lady detained. She'd been detained. She was in care. And there'd been an incident. There was a certain incident had involved that girl, and she'd been taken into the police station. Now, the incident, I don't want to describe for grounds of confidentiality, but let's put it this way. It's the sort of thing that could happen at any home. It wasn't that bad. I'm not saying it was trivial, but it wasn't that bad. But she was in the police station. She wasn't happy. She was kicking off. She was doing everything possible and was being particularly, you could say, objectionable, but she was distressed, and that was very clear. And I came in, she was with somebody from the care home. That was perhaps the point that Beth's making, not Beth-Anne. That's maybe not the best person to have been with her, but that's the person. The minute I walked in the room, that person walked out. And I looked at her and, kind of, obviously we discussed what it was about, and, we discussed where she was going to be interviewed, etc. And fundamentally, I looked at her and I said, you've got choices here. You can continue to, unfortunately, behave the way you are for whatever reason. And I can tell you there's one outcome, and that's you're going to be in the police station. I'm not going to get you out because I'm not going to let you out. But if you do what I suggest you do, calm down, let's get through the next stage, then you're going back. It must be more comfortable. She took one look at me and decided, luckily, to take option 2. And so we managed to get her out of the police station back to the comparative, comfort of the care home. Now, I do think that that example shows that it's not about legal advice. It's relatively easy to give her legal advice. I knew what she should do, but it's about the way you deal with her. And she basically obviously trusted me. She had respect and she followed my advice. And we had the outcome that still didn't take away from the fact that she was in the police station. There had been an incident, but I like to think that that was an end of that matter. it wasn't going to progress, I'm certain, through the criminal justice system at any level. And, you know, what came there is my experience of dealing with children, because I'd had children, I dealt with children, and I looked at it from that approach. And that's really why I say the solicitor has such an important role, both to understand the law, but to understand the client. And to an extent, it's no different with a child than any other client, but it is. And that's where the experience of people like Beth-Anne and some of the work Irina and others have done, then basically that's why it's so important to give that warning, to give that support, and also hopefully to use these opportunities of this kind of conference to come together to talk about our experiences from all sectors, to perhaps strengthen what we do next time, or strengthen that bit of training, that guidance that is provided, so that what we can do for the children that find themselves in that situation is to give them the best support, to give them the practical support. And as I say, you've got to look at it where you know, they're coming from different angles in the sense of the incident or whatever has already happened. But perhaps another way to look at it, and I think solicitors don't always think of this, is that was that occasion. I do wonder what happened to that young lady later on. This was 4 or 5 years ago. Did she end up getting through it all and getting to an easier time in her life? Did she not? But I like to think that my role with her perhaps helped in that occasion to get her through a challenge in her life, and that perhaps we could part having both felt that we'd got the best outcome for the situation I'm in, you know, she was in. So I only put that as an example. And compassion, etc. I can see coming in the chat box. Exactly, it's empathy, compassion. You can't change it. And, you know, it's tough dealing with clients because sometimes you have to say, you know, this is a position, there is nothing I can do about it, but this is where we are. But trying to meet them halfway, trying to understand where they're coming from. And as I say, I was mighty relieved. 2 o'clock in the morning, I got home to my bed at 4, but it might not have been that way if I hadn't managed to get through to her. So I really like hearing from people like Beth-Anne because they tell me what is needed. I would just say by way of close that the Criminal Justice Scotland Act 2016 does very clearly set out the framework and rights for children in custody. They are quite specific, and therefore I would suggest anyone that wants to know what these rights are, they're there, and they do include access to a responsible adult and access to a solicitor. And I would suggest that if there's any indication that these rights are not being observed, that is a matter to take up with Police Scotland or the appropriate organisation as, you know, something that is lacking. And that comes back to making sure, exactly like a number of you said, that children do understand and know their rights. And I totally accept what Beth-Anne says. I mean, understanding and knowing your rights at, you know, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, how many of us understood big words at that time? I doubt very many of us. So hopefully that experience does maybe help. I'm not sure, Fiona, but that maybe puts a bit of colour from the solicitor profession that it's not always the easiest thing, but the more information, experience, training and advice and work going on, I can only hope benefits me and all my fellow professionals. But thank you for the opportunity to speak.
No, thank you, Gillian, really appreciate it. And thank you to all the panellists.